Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today, we're speaking about what's happening here in the Middle East and around the region, and maybe also in the West related to what's happening here. And we're going to have with us my good friend Khaled Hassan. Khaled is an Egyptian British national security expert with foreign policy experience of over 14 years in combating anti-Semitism, extremism, and all its forms, especially what we see happening in the Middle East throughout here, and we'll talk about that with him. Khaled has been advising governments throughout the world on combating extremism, anti-Semitism, and understanding the Middle East and this region at large. Khaled also has important. I was going to read, but there's so I can just say it out loud because I pretty much know what I'm going to say. So Khaled has been advising a lot about behind the scenes of the Abraham Accords that happened and maybe will happen soon. More countries will join. So we'll see. We'll talk about that with him. And Khaled also has advised, and we'll ask him about that, about President Trump's plan for Gaza and given his expertise to the Israeli president on an initiative that he has here. So Khaled, it's a great pleasure to finally speak with you.
Thanks, Ariel. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Amazing, and likewise, let's just start. We just with Iran. So we just finished here this war with Iran. We were going to speak during the war. We didn't know the war was happening, so we had to cancel because all the sirens here and the kids at home. So logistically, it was very difficult. But now it seems like we're back to normal. Normal. It's weird normal because the war's still going on in Gaza. And last night we're recording this on Tuesday, and last night there was huge bombings in Gaza City and orders of evacuation by the IDF. This is like a non-ending war, and we'll talk about that. But maybe just let's stick on Iran for now. What we saw in the region during the Iran war was something that was pretty amazing for those who might not be in depth about what's happening. Every single Arab country in the entire region surrounding Israel and Iran, pretty much, maybe they made some voices, but pretty much either supported or didn't bother Israel from doing what it needed to do. How do you explain this?
Yes, so it's actually very interesting because I think what was very interesting, even ahead of the Israeli strike, which was to many people unexpected. Many people did not expect it to come, this early. 3 hours ahead of the strike, I posted a photo with a glass of whiskey on Twitter, and I said, "L'chaim, this is starting," because I knew it was coming. It was fascinating, and I think Iran is now becoming an issue that really shows, where countries are heading. It's, in intelligence analysis, we have, because I'm an intelligence analyst by profession, and I've been doing this, focusing on the Arab world in the context of the Arab Israeli conflict for, over 14 years. So I think we have indications and warnings, a system that tells us, right, this country believes in XYZ, or this country wants to do XYZ in the future. And Iran was one of the biggest, give us the most reliable, in my view, framework for indications and warnings. So we saw, for example, how the Saudi government issued statements saying we condemn the Israeli attacks against Iran, blah, blah, blah. But no one actually meant it. And by saying no one actually meant it is when you talk to Saudis, when you talk to, Saudis who are well connected to the government, Saudis who are well connected to the royal family, and to the crown prince, you know that those people recognize that Iran is a threat. It's the most serious threat to the Muslim Sunni world. And that's why a lot of those countries, they had to issue these statements because these statements avoided, the possibility that Iran might attack them because they have obviously U.S. interests, so a lot of U.S. investments and a lot of very it's essentially the most powerful alliance on the planet. That's how I refer to it really when I talk to anyone in Saudi Arabia, because you're talking about the Gulf and the U.S., which is a lot of potential, a lot of investments, a lot of military hardware. So those people understand this. They're not stupid. They understand this. They know what they're doing, but you could see, so the response was really interesting because you could see that some people were, you know, very in favor of the strikes, but again, just sort of having these diplomatic statements saying, "Oh, we don't have anything to do with this. We reject this. We condemn this." But then you could see a country like Egypt, which was virtually saying, and you see this from officials, you see this from people who are very close to President Sisi, saying we are siding with Iran. And I'm talking about, publicly and openly and blatantly saying, we're not on Israel's side here. We are completely against Israel. Israel is the enemy. Iran is the ally in this. So that was, again, an indication, of where these countries are going. And that's why, it's one of, and the fact that Saudis were actually allowed and given, complete freedom to talk about this is a huge indication in and of itself.
And
So you had Egypt.
Khaled,
Yes.
one of the things that we should, I guess, put forth here is the fact that the Jordanians and a few other places, but we for sure the Jordanians were helping to knock down the drones that Iran was shooting at us.
Yes, so Jordanians are part of this alliance. They're part of this US alliance. And everyone who's part of this US alliance had to do two things essentially. Number one, they tried not to get in the way. So, right, you get on with the job. We're not going to get in the way. And the second thing is, if they saw any drones or any missiles essentially going through their airspace, they had to take them down because it was a matter of sovereignty. That's how they played it. That's how they presented it to their own domestic politics essentially, and their own population. Especially Jordan. Jordan has had enough of this because there's a huge issue around stability in Jordan. So they were not going to play games with this. But that again leaves us at the point where you have people who are whether it's very openly talking about this or sort of reluctantly within this alliance. They have a role, they have a positive role to play, and then you had others who were virtually, or at least just by rhetoric, joining the axis of resistance. And we still see this today. I mean, it's fascinating because yesterday I was looking at someone, an Egyptian commentator who's connected to the government, well connected to the government, and he's still saying we are now building an alliance with Iran that is going to change the map of the Middle East. And that is yesterday. That wasn't, before the war. So it's fascinating. Some people still, going where they were going initially. We can explain why, but this is where we are.
We will talk about Egypt specifically soon because I think people in the West and even people in our region don't understand the what's happening inside of Egypt and how serious it actually is. But we'll talk about. I wanted to also one of the things that you've been speaking about, and I've reading your stuff privately and publicly, is about Syria. So one of the things that we saw during this war was that the new Syrian regime of Jolani and his new name Ashara, whatever you want to call him, he has a number of names, but this guy who started off in as like the worst type of jihadist and now controls the country basically said, I'm not even going to contest. Just go over my airspace and bomb Iran. Basically, use my airspace to do basically whatever you want. And then we learn pretty much like right after the war, or even during, that the U.S. and the Saudis have been brokering talks, direct talks, with Israeli representatives and his, meaning the Syrian regime's representatives, top people, talking about getting to an agreement about, first of all, security matters, and then long term to some sort of joining the Abraham Accords, meaning they will recognize Israel formally. And could you imagine the next one of the potential next countries that will join the famous Abraham Accords might be a country that is run by a jihadist or a former jihadist or whatever you want to call it? And can you explain how this is happening and what role the Saudis are playing and why their role is so important?
Yes, I actually can imagine this because I said this exactly on the 28th of February 2025 before anyone could even talk about it. I got comments from people saying, "You're a madman. What are you talking about? What do you mean Syria will join the Abraham Accords? This is a joke. This is a jihadist." But most people do not understand the nuance of what we're dealing with here. So this man was a jihadist, according to what we have on him, the information we have on him, who was very much involved in the Levant. He was very much involved in a kind of jihad that is basically revolutionary. This is kind of like revolutionary movements in Latin America, who, see that, right, we're ruled by someone who's a dictator. We want to get rid of this dictator. So that's the thing here. This man is not inherently anti-Israel, anti-Western. He's a pragmatist. He's clearly a realist. Although during the first week when he actually took over, I was concerned. I voiced my concerns and I said, hold on a moment. We've got someone who is a jihadist now in Syria, so this doesn't look good. And within days, I could see who this man was, and I completely changed my view of him based on his actions. This is a man who was, number one, willing to recognize that rhetoric does not get you anywhere. He could have said, "We're going to fight Israel. We're going to, take the Golan Heights. We're going to do X, Y, Z." He didn't say any of this. He only decided to just, you know what, I'm going to adopt this peace and quiet approach, which is the approach that actually leads to the Abraham Accords. Peace and quiet in the region essentially means I don't want any wars, I don't want any fights with anyone. All I want is to be given the chance to focus on my own, my country's issues, the economy and all that stuff. So that's why on the 28th of February I said this is going to happen. This is where we're heading now. Now, this man has been given a lot of support by Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia does not want Iranian militias in Syria. And they also want to end the war. Even before this man took over, Saudi Arabia was engaged in an initiative that wanted to bring back Bashar al Assad to the Arab League and deal with him and make sure that he would at least get the Iranian militias out. He didn't want to. So that's the thing. Bashar al Assad did not want to do this. And that's why the Saudis see this man, the alternative, as actually a really good opportunity. So they worked with him. They gave Syria a lot of money to essentially pay off its debts, to be able to have, bakeries opening up again. And that is the Saudi influence. It's one that brings stability, it's one that brings peace and quiet, especially under the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And this is why we see Syria where it is today. He has been told by the Saudi government, you need to avoid, the Nasserist or, the Bashar al-Assad kind of rhetoric on Israel. You need to avoid all that stuff. Make peace. We want you to have a sovereign Syria. So let's see how we can get to this stage where we can get the Israelis out of Syria and you in a position where you rule a unified sovereign Syria, and we're going to back you up.
And Khalid, also, can you talk about the one of the things that we know about Syria, that Turkey, who at this point I think is more anti-Israel than the Saudis, in a weird turn of events. If like 10, 15 years ago, if you would have said that, no one would have believed you, but that's where we are. They are really supporting this guy. So there's like two forces, tell me if you agree, that are pushing on him, and I think in a little bit of two different directions pulling him. So on the one hand, the Saudis and the Americans and even the Israelis at this point, who are talking directly with his people, are saying, "Come to us. We'll be able to give you stability. We'll be able to talk, cooperation, money, all this kind of stuff." And the Turks are saying, "We're on your border on the north. We can give you stability from the north. We will stop the jihadists from coming in. We'll be able to help you with the minorities that may be flaring up against you once in a while." What is the influence that Turkey has on him, and do you think that it might be a danger?
So here's one thing. Number one, Turkey is not anti-Israel. So Turkey can say whatever it wants to say. Publicly it says one thing. Privately they do the opposite. And we've been seeing, trade between Israel and Turkey. And not only this, so here is the beautiful thing. Turkey and Egypt, I actually said that Turkey is one of the main threats for Israel, and not just Israel, by the way, but also moderate Sunni countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because they have ambitions, regional ambitions where they see themselves as the Ottoman Empire. And that's because of Erdogan. It's his own vision. Every leader has a vision. When we had Putin, his vision prior to invading Ukraine, he said it publicly. He wrote about it and he said, I believe, that we need to be the Soviet Union again. We need to regain this, stance in the world where we are a superpower. And I don't believe that there is such a thing as Ukraine. Ukraine is basically Russia, it's part of Russia. So all of that stuff gives you a lot of indications. Erdogan is very much the same. He believes I'm the Ottoman Empire. I should have, influence beyond the borders of Turkey. So that's what he's going for. But Turkey itself, as a country, Ataturk's Turkey is a secular place. It does not see itself ideologically against Israel, which is why whatever happens, it is mostly rhetoric. And when Erdogan goes, hopefully, he'll be replaced by someone who's not affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, But that's why I don't think what they're doing in Syria is, you know, trying to support any jihadists or trying to support any anti-Israel element. They're just trying to gain influence, which is understandable. This is a tough neighborhood.
What is the influence that they would want from him to try to hold down the Kurds? So, like, what does Turkey want exactly from the influence? What are they trying to get?
So Turkey essentially wants him to be their man. Like we get what we want from him. Like we essentially fund him, we give him some support, and he's our man in Damascus in a way. And obviously, yes, there is a lot of issues around separatist movements, and we know this in Turkey, and that's actually going to be his main challenge. Separatist movements and different factions who might be fighting. So the fighting is not over in Syria. I don't think it will be anytime soon, to be honest. But that's understandable. The thing is, the Turks and the Saudis and the Americans have a framework. A framework where they deal together, where they sit down and talk and say, "This is a red line. You can't do this. You can't do this." Which is why I'm not awfully concerned. I'm awfully concerned about Erdogan's, broader project in the region, which is regional influence and dominance and all that stuff, but not when it comes to Syria.
Okay, so one of the things that I've always not understood is that the Mohammed bin Salman MBS, he seems to be, and I think not even seems. This is like the wisdom of everyone who speaks about it at this point is that he's very moderate, very modern. He's modernizing his country. He's doing a lot of the stuff to get out of the religious, I guess, extremism and move towards a more modern and Western even society in a lot of ways, and you mentioned that a little bit until now. And but on the other hand, they seem to be the last country that's talking with Israel. So they'll push the Syrians into it, and they'll push the Bahrainis last time, and the UAE, and but they are more reluctant to actually go into it, to actually sign with Israel, to actually be open about doing it. Do you think that there's a chance that this, now that Iran is severely degraded, and now that Israel has emerged again, as in 2017, 18, 19, during the first Trump administration, as a global, not just, I guess, I don't, superpower is not a global, as a regional superpower, and also someone who you can rely on to be in touch with the Americans. So sort of like an influence you can use the Israelis to direct talks with the U.S. president, who's tweeting, by the way, about Bibi's trial. So he's such a good friend that he's even trying to get Bibi out of jail or out of going to court. So can you? Do you think that now it'll be the time they can do it? They feel maybe that now the constraints of the way the region looks at them and all these other stuff can be worked on.
So there are two things where I disagree. Number one, the Saudis do not need anyone to contact President Trump. They don't need anyone. President Trump is probably he has two friends in the region. I would probably, well, actually three friends. I'll probably say the three friends are Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, Bibi, and definitely Mohammed bin Zayed. So he has those people as close and personal friends, and they share a certain vision for the region. So the Saudis don't need Israel. They don't need Israel to contact the Americans. They don't need Israel to work with the Americans. They have basically unfettered access to the Americans. And I think this is where people misunderstand things. The Saudis do not need the Abraham Accords. By the way, the Emiratis did not need the Abraham Accords. And you see this from the Emiratis. The Abraham Accords was a reflection of the Emirati identity. The Emiratis have been taught from such a young age something that is really quite rare in the Arab world. They've been taught not to ask people about their religion. So they would never ask you, "Are you Muslim? Are you Jewish?" This is like a personal thing, which is very Western. Everywhere else in the Arab world, including in Saudi Arabia, by the way, there's still an emphasis on religion. So, are you not a Muslim? Like people would ask you, like, "What are you doing? This is not a good thing. Are you not a Muslim? Do you not believe in, like, in these values? This is against the values of Islam." But the Saudis are really impressive. So the Saudis are also doing stuff that is very much similar to, the Emirati society. So now we have tolerance, and this is how it begins. Tolerance of Jews, saying, look, it's okay to be Jewish and come here in Saudi Arabia, and visit. So they're really doing things gradually, and they're doing things in their own Saudi way. By the way, the Saudis also do not believe that they want to, westernize their
So how
society.
would you call it? Modernize?
It's not even modernized. They believe that they want to go back to the tolerant roots of Islam. This is what is, this is the argument from Saudi Arabia now, which is actually really quite impressive. If you look at the Quran itself, you're not going to see blatant hatred of Jews. It's very limited in comparison with, the hadith and other, other texts essentially. So what they're doing is they're saying, let's go back to the roots of Islam where the Prophet Muhammad, lived and worked with Jews, and there were Jews in Saudi Arabia. That is essentially what they're saying. There were Jews in Saudi Arabia. We're not against Jews.
But beyond Jews, Khalid, they're also in terms of education, women, alcohol. Now they're talking about bringing in certain areas and certain hours, different things that, again, 10 years ago, even less, we would find like amazing. But now it's like, okay, this is the next thing they're letting happen, and this is the next thing. So it's not just about the Jews, right? It's about a different version of Islam he's trying to push into the system.
Yes, but I would probably say he's not trying to push it into the system. He's actually trying to, in a way, rediscover a version of Islam. I mean, most people do not know that before 1979 there were actually cinemas in Saudi Arabia. They had theaters. They had, life was more open. But there was a certain event where some people, some terrorists took over, Al Kaaba in Mecca, which is the holiest site for Muslims. And then the government decided, right, we really have a serious issue with, Islamists, and we need to sort of radicalize more to show them that we're following, a very strict form of Islam so that we can. But like he says, we're going back to a stage where we're more tolerant, we're more open. But primarily, this man has a vision that I don't think I've ever seen anything like this. He has a vision that is clear. He's very bold. He talks about it openly. So the Saudis, I have no issues. Like when you look at Saudi Arabia now, there is an ongoing social media war now between the Egyptians and the Saudis. And one of its core, and I wrote about this in my Substack, one of its ingredients is the fact that the Saudis are rejecting the Nasserist pan-Arab view, which is very loud, very nasty, very anti-Semitic, very anti-Israel, and they're saying, look, we are pragmatists. We don't want this nonsense. So it's generally speaking, it's the Saudi identity now is being rediscovered, and I think it's one of the most beautiful things to watch actually, and I'm really it's a blessing to be seeing this unfolding.
Yes, and maybe it can. Can you just answer about the fact that would you think we will see them? They don't need it, but as you said, it's a reflection of the ideals of the countries that did sign the Abraham Accords. Do you think that the Saudis are ready to come to that ideal of formally allowing is allowing their, like you said, the pragmatism to be shown with regards to Israel?
Yes, I think so. So I think
We'll
what's
see
going
that
to.
soon. You think?
Yes, yes, I probably would say. I mean, my estimation, and this is based, by the way, on conversations with people who are, who know. Let's just say they know what they're talking about. Within 1 or 2 years, there will be an Israeli embassy in Riyadh. That's what I was actually told, but they might not join the Abraham Accords.
Okay, so it'll be something separate.
Yes, exactly. Something separate, something suitable for Saudi Arabia because they believe Saudi Arabia has a special place. It's not going to join, a league of other smaller countries. That's how they view it. But there will be an embassy, so they will have diplomatic relations. When and how this is going to happen, I don't really know, but I fundamentally believe this is going to happen. And by the way, if you go back, I wrote this on LinkedIn actually a few years ago. It doesn't matter. In many ways, it doesn't matter because if Saudi Arabia is willing and it does now allow Jews to travel to Saudi Arabia, do business, you're safe to visit as a Jew. Even people who are Israeli, that they do visit, they have been visiting. So in my view, it's already happening. It's already been happening. I don't know what, like the present. So here, let's look at this fact. There is an Israeli embassy in Cairo, but the relations with the Egyptians are much, much, much worse. So the embassy for me is not like this wow moment. It's just primarily what the embassy does is the leaders can celebrate it. they can say this is a diplomatic achievement. So it's mostly going to be President Trump or Bibi or whoever else is going to be in government, by then, and definitely Mohammed bin Salman, and they're going to say, look, this is a diplomatic achievement. We now have peace. But other than this, the embassy doesn't really do much for you or me. Like it's like if we can visit, then it's the same, isn't it?
We also know one of the things that there's reports, and there was the secret messages that these letters that they found of Yahya Sinwar in Gaza that said that one of the reasons they decided to do the October 7th attack when they did it was because they wanted to try to slow down the talks between the Saudis and the Israelis. How much do you think that played in? Do you think that the Iranians were really worried? Because, like you say, it doesn't really matter in terms of the behind the scenes diplomacy, the military cooperation, which is happening in behind the scenes again. So why were the Iranians? Because it seems that they were worried. The Hamas was worried, which was obviously getting these worried signals from Iran. It's not like Hamas was like so strategic about Saudis and Israel. So why was that playing into behind the scenes stuff?
So I don't really believe in that because if you ask me, Sinwar was always going to try something. This is the mission of his life. It's very much like you've seen Bibi saying Iran is a threat for his entire existence, and it was going to come one way or another. That's it's the same for Sinwar. Yes, this was a factor. The fact I think what really was concerning for people like Sinwar and terrorists and pretty much every Palestinian terrorist was that they were feeling forgotten. So terrorism is it's the use of violence. This is the very basic academic definition of terrorism. It's the use or threatening to use violence for political, religious, social aims, whatever. So they felt like, this is our language. We're not being heard. So we have to speak our language to essentially have a presence, to be even noticed. And that's the interesting part because, after President Trump and after, obviously, he moved the embassy to Jerusalem and everything else, everyone was forgetting about the Palestinians because let's face it, it's convenient to forget about the Palestinians because if you don't, you're going to get into a lot of nasty stuff. You go and talk to the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas is upset that you're not talking to them. You try to like Egypt did, you try to bring both sides to Cairo and say you need to have you know basically an agreement and stop fighting each other. They just don't. So once you get into the Palestinian issue, it's an issue that cannot be resolved. And everyone who's tried to resolve it came out of the other side completely and utterly frustrated and just hating everything about this entire conflict. And that's since President Sadat, by the way. President Sadat said this. President Mubarak said this. There's a video of President Mubarak, referring to Yasser Arafat saying, sign Yabn al Kalb, which is you son of a dog. Because he wouldn't sign. So people had just had enough. And now, by doing this, and now by seeing Gazans die, the Palestinians can once again say, hold on a moment, we are dying. Why are you not considering our interests in your policies?
But you know what's so weird about this is that until Trump came in 2016, and I do want to ask you about this just in general, the feeling among the foreign policy establishment in the West was that the key to solving every problem in the Middle East was to get a deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And Trump comes along and just bypasses all of that and starts signing these agreements. You call them peace, you call them diplomatic agreements, doesn't really matter. He starts getting the Israelis and a lot of the Arab countries on record or behind the scenes talking with each other. And suddenly the Palestinians and their supporters in the West and in the Arab world suddenly saw, oh my God, he's turning the entire paradigm in a way that goes against everything we were trying to sell to the world. And I think that, like you said, they were forgotten because they didn't no one needed them anymore. They weren't needed to be remembered.
Yes, yes. This is fascinating. And I said this again, on my social media. When John Kerry said there was a certain interview before President Trump came over, where he was saying, John Kerry is the former Secretary of State under Obama. And he says on record the Arab leaders tell me we will not have peace with Israel, we will not normalize relations with Israel unless you resolve the Palestinian issue. And I was laughing at this. It's so remarkably stupid because what we see in the West is, so there are two things to this. Number one, they cling to a certain assumption, and they believe that this assumption is valid. They do this for many reasons, including the fact that they want to simplify things. So if I don't understand what Ariel is doing, I just want to say to myself, hold on, maybe Ariel is not a nice guy. And that's it. It's so easy to understand. It's so easy to be like, okay, this is resolved. I've got it all done. And this is precisely what they did with the Middle East. If you want to resolve any conflicts, if you want less terrorism, actually solve the Palestinian issue. And it's very easy to do this. You're just sitting back now and well, we can't solve it, so what can we do? But it's also the other part of it is there is a study now that it's actually quite similar how the US and the UK, the overwhelming majority of civil servants now, the people in the diplomatic service, the people even in the intelligence, lean left. So it's almost 7 or 10 out of every eight who now lean left. So they come with their own worldview and they don't want to question this. So for me, what John Kerry did, and I said this before even the Abrahamic words, by the way, he was completely ignorant of the fact that maybe Arabs want their own personal and country's interests before the Palestinians. And this is what he got totally wrong. And then we saw UAE saying, hold on a moment, our interests first. And then we saw the Saudis now saying, hold on a moment, our interests first. And now the Lebanese are trying to do it. Now the Syrians are doing it. So this is the collapse of the mind, the establishment mind. And we see this in the UK, by the way. Former ministers have said something, for example, before President Trump was elected for his second term, he's not going to win. I put my money on this. He cannot win because of XYZ. And it's a mindset that generates these assumptions, and they just live according to these assumptions. The problem is when they make policy according to these assumptions, they set us back.
Yes, 100%. I agree. And now I want to talk to you about Egypt. So you are originally from Egypt. Tell me if I'm wrong. Did you grow up in Egypt or okay, so you're really from Egypt, and I I've been speaking to people who are experts in Egypt from Israel, and also some Egyptians who are whoever's in Egypt right now refuses to on the record talk, because if they talk to an Israeli, they get basically either killed or they have to run out of the country at this point. Um, why when Egypt signed in 78 or 79 the 78 the peace accords, there was a sort of speaking with someone who was part of the negotiating team. He's very old at this point, and he said to me, we thought that there was going to be real peace, that we can go and take trips to Egypt and we would sit and eat in restaurants in Cairo. And now I would advise no one to go to Egypt if you're an Israeli. Like, stay away, because you can just be killed, and it's a pure danger to be there. And when you look at opinion polls of Egyptians, they really hate Jews. It's like it's not even it's on the table. It's a really a country that the society in general. There obviously are exceptions. But in general, we had, for example, Dalia Ziada on our program like a month ago, and she was telling me in school, official government school, they were taught about the Jews being the worst of the worst. They were taught that the Egyptians kids are taught that they won in the Yom Kippur War to this day, that they killed all the Israelis. They're taught to hate Israel. They're taught that the peace, she said, between Israel and Egypt is just temporary. It's a hudna, meaning once they'll get stronger, they'll destroy Israel. Could you explain to us why this is happening?
So it's very interesting because you see the word hodna and you see it increasingly used after October 7th, and they're very open about it. They would go on TV, debating Arabic speaking Israelis, and they say this is a hodna. And I have to say, and I'm really glad we're saying this on record now, the Israelis have failed completely and utterly and miserably when it comes to understanding Egypt. And I'm talking about people in the intelligence community, I'm talking about people in the diplomatic service, and I'm telling you right now, they're doing it all over again. Thank God that it's Bibi Netanyahu in government now, because he's far more capable of understanding how these things work. If it was a diplomat making decisions now on this, I would be very concerned. I would be very, very concerned. And it's so what people fail to understand. And by the way, it's this is actually also one of the core issues. Again, if you've seen my Substack recently on, the ideological shifts between Saudis and Egyptians, you're going to see that one of the core issues I mentioned is around basically how the Saudis now say to Egyptians, "You lost in 1973. You didn't win. You keep saying it, you won, but you didn't win." The Egyptians obviously say we won, but the Saudis are saying, "Hold on, this is completely delusional." So it's actually quite
They really
interesting to
believe
see.
they won, by the way, or is it just
Yes, yes, yes.
propaganda?
No, 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 no. It's everyone in Egypt believes that Egypt won. In my view, Egypt strategically won. Both sides strategically won because the peace ended the war, and they both, both sides
But
had.
militarily, they lost at the end.
That's the different argument. They do not believe that militarily they lost, or militarily they did not even win. So whichever way you look at it, militarily there wasn't a win. Like there wasn't a win. But regardless of this, people believe that militarily and diplomatically and politically they won. Now, regardless of that very specific point, the problem with Egypt is, since 1952 to this day, Egypt's national collective identity has been formed and shaped by certain people. So anti Semitism has become, an inherent part of the Egyptian national collective identity. It's not the same for Saudis. It's not the same for Emiratis. It's not the same for Bahrainis. It's not the same for Kuwaitis. Only Egypt is this bad. And that's because it has been, there's this vicious circle of, I'll tell you why. It's this vicious circle of, it's unpatriotic not to hate the Jews. So you have to hate the Jews if you're a patriot, if you care about your country. And you have to hate the Jews if you are an Egyptian, patriot, Muslim, even if you're not Muslim, even Christians, you see that as well. It's very clear. But obviously, with the Christians, it's far less because they learn Hebrew, they learn Aramaic, even they so because of the Old Testament when they study it. Now, the key challenge is that consecutive Egyptian governments have played on this. They have used this to their advantage in essentially saying, "Look, I hate Israel. Israel is the greater enemy." Even if they say it in coded messaging, that is essentially what they're implying. They're implying that everything that happens, oh, we're not getting, we're not a developed economy because there is a plan, there is a plot, a Zionist plot. So it becomes this vicious circle of, the government feeding into this anti-Semitism, and then the people becoming really anti-Semitic, so the government cannot actually challenge them. Because once they do, then the government lost its credentials. And when you don't have something to stand on, so Mohammed bin Salman has something to stand on. He achieved incredible, tremendous, unbelievable, pretty much unprecedented economic success. So he can tell his people, "Look, I made your lives better. I know what I'm doing. Please trust me." And the people trust him. They love him. Consecutive Egyptian governments don't have this. So they don't do this. And since Mubarak took over in 1980 or 1981, he has been adamant on keeping the status quo. So stability at all costs. So not challenging perceptions, not challenging hatred, not doing any of this. So that's why you see that Egypt remains, and this is actually what, so there is a term now that the Saudis use when they refer to Egyptian mindset. They say il fasikhi. Fasikh. Fasikh is this fish that it's an Egyptian salted fish. You get the salted fish and you put it in like some jar and you close the jar really tight, and you essentially let it rot for, a while. And it's an ancient, the ancient Egyptians used to have this salted fish. But now Saudis use this term to describe the Egyptian mindset. You've been locked into, this era in time, which is the Nasser's time, and you have not been allowed to advance, that your brain actually rotted. And it's fascinating how Saudis and Saudi Arabia are the ones leading the fight to bring Egypt into 2025, not 1952. It's fascinating to watch this. I mean, it's I feel like, the most significant and consequential events in the Middle East almost always go unnoticed, and this is what's happening now.
But Khaled, can I just ask about Egypt a little more? So you're saying that part of the national identity is to hate Jews, basically?
Yes, yes, it's
So
part of
every
your.
Egyptian, if he's a patriotic Egyptian, is taught that in order to be patriotic, in order to be part of the national identity of being proud of your Egyptianhood, is that you have to not like the Jews.
Yes, yes,
But why? But there are no almost. I don't think there are any Jews at this point in Egypt. You don't meet the Jews. You don't see any Jews in the streets. They're non-existent. So you don't even know what the so like you're taught to hate something like it's for the regular Egyptian. The Jews are this sort of like Satan that you'll never see, but is always there somewhere in the background, making everything worse.
yes. You'll know it doesn't make a difference whether you see someone or not. Hatred works in an irrational way, and also by saying you're taught, it's not like it's blatantly. I mean, in some cases it's blatant, but in some other cases it's not. In some other cases it's basically the TV shows, for example, that show you that, hold on a moment, the zoo always talks in a nice quiet way, and they tell you, I love you and you're my friend, why don't you be my friend, I'm such a good guy. While they sneak behind you and sort of backstab you. That's it doesn't have to be like Jews are awful, written on every mosque. It's not, that's the case. It just isn't.
It's just a known fact that the Jews are the bad people. They're sneaky. They stab you in the back and all that.
Exactly, and it's done in such a fascinating way, because some of the Egyptian, most popular and most successful, TV dramas and all that stuff, they have that. There's this element where it becomes exotic, it becomes interesting to hate Jews. It becomes, people get terrified of Jews, and I mean, I'm talking about this from personal experience, and it's fascinating because when you talk to Egyptians, there is no even it's I can't now join any Egyptian space on Twitter. The spaces are like, audio conferences where you have a lot of people talking, because there is no reasoning with the Egyptians who have this mindset. The overwhelming majority of Egyptians, you can't reason with them.
It's conspiracy theory. It's all conspiracy. The Jews behind everything. Everything bad is the Jews. All this kind of stuff, right?
It's beyond that even. It's beyond conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories in the West, we can sort of dismantle them. We can sit down and have a talk. We can sit down. This is something else. This is an entire different level. And I think, to be honest, we can write books about this. But again, it's done in such a magnificent way that it's just so deeply rooted. It's become, it. I don't know how you can actually undo this. I believe, you need someone like Mohammed bin Salman in Egypt, but it's virtually impossible. And things are going to get worse with Egypt, a lot worse.
Can I just ask you about that? So we've been talking about it in the last few months a little bit less, but up until a few months ago, I saw in the Israeli press a lot being spoken about the troop surge of the Egyptian army in the Sinai. And in there was the prime minister's office at the time. I don't know what's happening with it now. They said we're taking care of it behind the scenes. We're talking with the Americans. They're pressuring the Egyptians. Maybe there was progress with that. We don't know at this point because I don't know. And I asked around a little bit. No one really wants to talk about it. But the Israeli government was, and the establishment in the military here were aware of the troop surge, which is goes against the peace accords, because the peace accord said a certain amount of troops are allowed to go into the Sinai, and the Egyptians are way past that amount, and they were building bases and airfields, and there was a worry, and I think there still is. Why would they do that if we're at peace with them? Unless they're going, they're getting ready for doing at some point in the future, maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but do you think at some point, because they hate us so much, because this is the mindset, that at the end of the day they would really love to attack Israel in some way or another?
So it's very interesting because there are two aspects to this. One is, the aspect that, well, the rhetoric that is used for domestic political consumption. And there is another aspect, which is when you talk to Egyptian decision makers, when you talk to Egyptian diplomats, the ones who don't want war and, they want peace and stuff, you get, in a way, a sensible argument. So the sensible argument is, the peace treaty is virtually suspended. We have a peace treaty, and that peace treaty now has been violated by Israel. This is what you would be told. When Israel went and took Rafah, when Israel went and took the Philadelphia corridor, the peace treaty that was updated when Israel left Gaza says that there should be no Israeli troops in Rafah. And that is true. There should be no Israeli troops taking over the Philadelphia corridor. That is true. But here's the thing. After 2011, there were there were not supposed to be military, Egyptian troops in Sinai. But the Egyptians went to the Israelis and said, "Hold on a moment, we've got a terrorism issue in Sinai. We need to take care of it." So the Israelis said, "Absolutely, please go ahead. We'll support you in any way we can. Good luck." You know. So the Israelis were really understanding. And by the way, I got this comment from one of the most prominent diplomats in Egypt, one of the most prominent diplomats in Egypt. And he said the Israelis are very understanding. This was around 2024 or something, 2014. Sorry. So when Israel needed a bit of understanding, the Egyptians did not pay it back. That's the challenge here. Yes, we know that obviously, the peace treaty says no Israeli troops in the Philadelphia corridor, but Israelis have been killed and kidnapped and murdered.
Yes, a small change.
Exactly. So there is a change here, and the Israelis expected the Egyptians to, what, we were understanding when you had issues. Why don't you be understanding when we have issues? So the Egyptians were not understanding, and they decided to do something separate.
So are you worried that behind the scenes is an alternative reason, or it's just because they want to show that they're responding to Israel's breach of the agreement?
So here's what's happening. What you see is there is a reason behind the scenes, and that reason is being essentially rejected by the Israeli establishment. And the reason being, in Egypt now, there is economic hell essentially. It's economic hell. This is where we're at now. Egypt is incredibly expensive. The economy, the VAT, the currency. It's Egypt is nearing bankruptcy. By the hour. So that's the challenge. Now, what do you do other than say it's because of the war? It's because of what's happening, and there is a plot against us. And we see this, by the way. President Sisi gave a speech yesterday where he said, and I'm quoting him, there can be no peace with bombings. There can be no peace when you force normalization on others. There can be no peace when normalization is not accepted by the people. So, the people of different countries. And the resistance will not stop. He used the resistance will not stop until you actually reach, a fair settlement. So this is what I've been saying for months now. There is an escalation in rhetoric, and that escalation is used essentially as a smokescreen for Egypt's internal and domestic issues.
So, but
Now,
how is that relevant to that fact that so that's all rhetoric? Here they're actually building airfields and moving in armored vehicles, they
yes,
said, and all this kind of new things that they're actually moving physically into. Is that because they want to show that they're like these pictures are shown to the Egyptian public and show, oh, look, we're getting ready to do something. Oh,
yes,
so
yes.
it's
So
all internal.
it's all internal. The
There's no
Egyptians
reason to be
believe.
worried about in Israel of them actually trying to do something.
Well, no, I think you have to be worried. That's my argument. You have to be worried. It's all internal, but you don't know what could happen. You don't know where it could go. My assessment is Egypt will suspend the peace treaty at some point, like officially say we've suspended the peace treaty, because there is. So the other aspect to this is we're looking at an Egypt that is increasingly isolated. So the Saudi government said around 2021 or 2022, we're no longer giving unconditional aid. And again, all this is explained in my Substack. You'll see, like, it's very clearly explained the
So
different
everyone
factors.
go to your Substack after this.
Yes, it's very funny because that reminds me of Zah Hawass, an Egyptian scientist, but we'll get to that later. But the point is, what we're talking about here is, so Egypt is increasingly isolated. Egypt has demands for economic and anti corruption measures. The Saudis said, we're not going to give you unconditional aid anymore. You need to have reforms. You need to get the state out of the economy. You need to privatize, blah, blah, blah. The Egyptians find these demands unacceptable. So the Egyptians now had a lifeline that was provided to the government by the Gulf. This lifeline is drying up now. So they went and said, we're going to have an alliance with Iran. They're still saying that until now. So the problem is, the more Egypt is isolated, and there is actually so many indications that people are missing. So, for example, and that's one of the things that the Saudis say, during the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, the Gulf did not even call President Sisi. So they had calls between each other saying, "Hold on a moment, we see rockets going to Qatar, we see blah blah blah. This is happening. Let's How do we deal with all that stuff?" No one even phoned Egypt. So Egypt is being driven into irrelevance as somewhat a member of this axis of resistance. And that's also because when you saw President Sisi going to the Arab League in Baghdad, which is actually called by the Saudis as the Iran Summit, because once you arrive at the airport in Baghdad, you're going to see photos of Qasem Soleimani. You're going to see photos of senior IRGC commanders. The Saudis said, "No way, we're not going to this." And the Saudis and the Emiratis also did not go to President Sisi's summit on the reconstruction of Gaza. So there are fundamental issues here. We're talking about a fundamental, a dispute that is developing based on really fundamental issues. The problem is, the more President Sisi does not get money, the more he doesn't get any backing from the Gulf, the more he has issues with President Trump. Remember, he's the only one who hasn't met him even so far. He hasn't even met him. So Egypt now is becoming this pariah state, and the only thing that President Sisi can do to justify the horrific economic situation is say, that's because we're virtually at war. We're engaged, they're engaged in a diplomatic war against us and then in an economic war against us. And he said something yesterday in his speech that proves this. He said, the challenges we're facing are immense. The challenges are unbelievable, essentially. But we will not bow except for Allah. And this is the rhetoric of a man who says, they want me to bow to them. They want me to let the Palestinians in. They want me to do X, Y, Z. But I am the only leader in the Arab world who's standing by the Palestinians. And I'm the only strong leader, basically.
It's very, very weird. I'll just say, because I wanted to ask you one last thing, and so we're going to get off Egypt, but just two, maybe three short comments about this. The first is that Egypt basically has been breaching the deal all the way since Israel left Gaza, meaning that the Rafah crossing and the Philadelphia corridor have been used, with Egypt knowing, at least the Egyptian officers in the area, to bring in tons of weapons into the Gaza Strip. There's no way that the Egyptian officers sitting on the Rafah crossing and all throughout the Philadelphia corridor didn't know that under them there's these giant tunnels that are bringing in like tractors and drilling equipment and all this kind of things. And we also know for a fact that Egyptian officers were being bribed by millions, literally millions of dollars to let equipment bring in. And during the war, we know also that people who want to get out from Gaza have to pay lots of money to the people there, to the Egyptian officers. So everything there seems to be either knowingly or because Egypt is such a corrupt place that these things are being allowed to happen for decades at this point. And the second thing that seems to me to be very weird is that they keep on saying we are the only ones, like you said, helping the Palestinians. We're putting our neck out there. But at the end of the day, they are the ones that are holding 2+ million Palestinians from leaving. So, meaning, if I was a Palestinian in Gaza and I didn't want to have anything to do with Hamas, and I just wanted to make my family go to a safe place, the people who are not allowing me to do this in the name of helping me are the Egyptians. Because all they had to do was to let some sort of safe corridor of people to leave and go to other places, or even to sit in the Sinai until the war is over, or whatever. They're the ones that, because of their, I don't know why. Well, we can know why, but my point is that they're the ones that are holding the people back from actually helping the people on the ground, and then they use that as saying we're not giving in, we're not letting the Americans tell us to let these people out. So it's a very weird dynamic, right?
So it's very interesting because there are two issues here. So one, we don't know for a fact, we don't have material evidence that the Egyptian army was being bribed to actually, let these tunnels continue. But what we do know is that there are issues and questions that are unanswered. Let's put it this way. If you're writing an academic paper on this, you have questions. When you
Yes,
go to
at
the
the very
Egyptian
least.
government, yes, exactly. When you go to the Egyptian government and say, hold on a moment, why is this tunnel allowed here? You will get, and that's the official response, there is no tunnel. What are you talking about? There is no tunnel. So that's the issue. But Egypt did actually engage, and President Sisi spoke about this, by the way. He said, I went to President Mubarak. He spoke about this in 2024, 2014, sorry, and said, I went to President Mubarak when I was head of the military intelligence, and I said, hold on a moment, there are so many tunnels going from Egypt to Gaza. Why have we not dismantled these tunnels? Why is nothing being done about these tunnels? So he spoke about this publicly in a conference. And then when he took over, there was a campaign, and we have to be honest, in his defense, there was a campaign to flood tunnels, to destroy tunnels, and literally hundreds of tunnels were destroyed. Up to 2021, Egypt was engaged in a campaign from 2024, 2014, sorry, to 2021. Egypt was flooding tunnels, destroying tunnels almost on a daily basis. And they actually moved Egyptians from the Egyptian side of Rafah in Sinai to do just that. So that's one aspect that we have to, that's one aspect we have to recognize. But there are now issues, and the challenge that Saudis and Emiratis and Israelis and Americans and everyone has with Egypt now is that there is no serious conversation. Like when you talk and say, right, why is this happening? How can we address it? Even if there are issues, the Egyptian government can say, okay, well, we didn't know that this tunnel was there. We tried, but people missed stuff. Israel missed a lot of stuff in Gaza. Obviously, Israel missed a lot of tunnel almost coming close to the Israeli border. That's fine. People make mistakes. We're human here. But you need to admit that stuff. You need to say, look, okay, if there are issues, let's sit down, let's talk, let's. Yes, so this is the challenge we're facing. You're dealing with someone who would rather keep the status quo, would rather deny any wrongdoing than actually say, hold on a moment, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe there was an issue. Maybe there was a tunnel we didn't know existed. It's very human, like I said, and it's difficult. These tunnels are extremely challenging, and Hamas is very good at building these tunnels. And by the way, it's the same concept when it comes to the Houthis. So the Saudis, for example, asked the Egyptians to join in 2015 in their campaign against the Houthis. And that was, at a time when President Sisi said, if the Gulf says, come and help us, we'll be right away. We're becoming right away and stuff. And then he just refused to join. And then again, he refused to join another campaign in the early 2020s. So that's the challenge. Egypt is becoming this actor where you can't even have a reasonable conversation. And that means everyone now has decided, right, we're going to completely shun you, we're going to completely ignore you, and we're just going to move on. And you could see this also in reports coming out of Israel. So Israel had suggested, why don't we build sensors along the Philadelphia corridor and have a limited Israeli presence and Egyptian presence so that we can coordinate and make sure the tunnels are not built. The Egyptians refused. So the Israelis said, well, okay, let's have completely AI stuff. Let's have sensors, advanced sensors, blah blah blah, to make sure there are no tunnels, and we won't have Israeli soldiers across the Philadelphia corridor. The Egyptians refused. So we're getting a lot of stuff where they just say, no, I'm not even talking to you. I've done nothing wrong. You're the one in the wrong here. Let's just move on. I don't want to talk to you. So it's unbelievable, basically.
It's actually very depressing because if they would, I told this to Dalia, there is potential if the mindset would be different, if they wouldn't hate us so much. No one in Israel that I know, and I've been here for at this point 20 plus years. I moved here from the US. I've never heard anyone say we hate Egyptians. Never. Never. And the contrary, every time an Egyptian breaks the silence, so to speak, from Egypt and is willing to talk to Israelis, we're so happy. Oh, this Egyptian guy wants to talk to us. This is amazing. We can speak with each other. And then they like either have to run out of Egypt. Like there's been a few of those over the years. Uh, so, so like if what I mean is that if the Egyptian society in 78, 79, in the 80s would have been open to changing the way it looks at, frankly, Jews, like you spoke about, but also Israel and um, and all that. We could have had, in terms of, for example, the Egyptian economy. We're neighbors. The tourism industry would be way better in terms of Israelis coming in. Israelis like to spend money. It would have helped the Egyptian economy. High tech stuff would be able to be working together. It's such a tragedy that they decided to go for hate instead of working together. It's actually very sad. Okay, um, don't answer that because we don't have a lot of time. I wanted to ask you one last thing, and that is Qatar. Um, Ever since the October 7th attack, and even before, I remember we were speaking in Israel, there was always a debate about letting the Qataris bring in the bags of cash to Hamas, to Gaza. There was always this guy that would land from Qatar. He was the emissary of Qatar. He would come in Ben Gurion airport with literally suitcases full of dollars. He would be driven by the Israeli government, security people, all the way to Gaza, like a hour and a half drive without traffic. He would be brought in, and then there'll be videos and pictures of people with the dollars in their hands and everything. It's a very crazy place between you and me, but this whole region. But then after October 7th, the discussion became even more like, what are the Qataris playing? They're on the one hand supporting Hamas, they have the American air base in their area, the American President Trump was just there, love them. A lot of Israelis do, former military people do tons of business with Qatar, and their rhetoric is all over the place. And so I guess that's also what they're using, the fact that they're friends with Iran, friends with all the terrorists, and also friends with the West, so they can be this sort of bridge. But the question is if the bridge itself, them, aren't taking a stand, which is extremely dangerous to the West.
Yes, I think to be honest, Qatar is difficult to read in many ways, but also Qatar is not as problematic as people make it seem. Because I think Qatar is, yes, it's definitely part of the US alliance. So the US has a lot of influence. Saudi Arabia has a lot of influence. The UAE has a lot of influence in Qatar. And I think the Israelis definitely have a degree of influence. So I think I'm not concerned about Qatar because mostly what they do, any harm they want to do, can be undone or it can be fought against. Essentially, if they want to support Hamas, you can do stuff about this. Israel is now in Gaza, so like in the future, I think essentially any potential negative aspect that they had or want to have is being addressed. Do you know what I mean? That's essentially what we're facing right now. So I'm not really concerned about Qatar. I think the main issue is I also predicted that Qatar will likely join the Abraham Accords at some point because it doesn't want to be left behind. If it faces the threat of being the only Gulf state that is left behind in this alliance, in this arrangement that will include a lot of trade, a lot of business, a lot of, serious stuff, I don't think they will want to be left behind. But I also think, again, the Israelis do have an issue. They do have an issue of, understanding threats, dealing with threats proactively. Everything that Israel has done now, they should have done ages ago. So Hezbollah, letting Hezbollah, sort of develop its capabilities, letting the Houthis develop these capabilities. I understand that there is a lot of pressure. Like you cannot go and invade Yemen. You cannot go, and bomb Yemen if Yemen has not bombed you. You have to sort of be like taking a self-defense position because even when you're defending yourself, Israel is under scrutiny. So let alone, taking proactive measures, that's going to be really tough to justify politically whether international community as well. But I think Israel should be changing. I'm hoping Israel will be changing, and also, like I said, with Iran, the war will start again. I'm sad to say. I think I think it actually never stopped. At least Mossad side,
It
is
was
very.
paused.
Yes, exactly. It was paused, but there are still intelligence operations. Stuff being blown up in Tehran every day. So it's still ongoing.
And by the way, people don't know today, for example, and yesterday, two cells of Iranian of Jews in Israel that were being paid by the Iranians to do intelligence missions for the Iranians were caught just today. To, and they it's a little bit weird how bad they are. I don't know how to assess this, and we should do an episode just on this with someone who understands how the Iranian intelligence works because almost all of the people that have been caught getting money from Iranians to do different things, the things they've been asked to do are ridiculous. For example, the person who yesterday was on TV, that they were showing the text messages that he was getting from his Iranian intelligence, the guy who was telling him what to do, and the money that he was transferring. And so the missions he got was to go to Ichilov Hospital in Tel Aviv and take pictures of the different wards and where the security people were. Most of that you can just do on Google Earth and stuff. It's not like a military secret. Or, for example, he was told to take. Some people were told to take videos and pictures of the hostage square where the families of the hostages were, and that's the TVs are all there all the time. You just open your TV. He was asked, and he said to the Iranian. This is one of the funny ones. He said. He wrote to him, he said, I can't, if you're going to ask me to take videos or pictures of the prime minister, I won't be able to do it because it's too difficult. So the Iranian says to him, no, you don't have to do it. We understand it's too difficult. And it's like, I was reading, I don't understand. Are they stupid, or is this like tests to make them dependent on them and then they'll use them? But the fact is that they're all getting caught. I don't know, maybe there's more, but they keep every day another person. And they're all usually very poor people from socioeconomic poor, and they're doing it for almost no money, 1,000 shekels to take a picture somewhere, to get to spy for a country that just shot at you missiles for just 1,000 shekels, which in dollars would be like $250, more or less. It
Yes,
seems.
it's. I
I'm
think what people
sorry.
need, it's insane. But what people need to understand is being ideologically motivated is not usually good for military and intelligence. Being ideologically motivated makes you stupid. And we've seen this. We've seen, even by the way, the Egyptian intelligence service says this. They say during the Nasser era, there were a lot of issues when it comes to, our work, the quality of our work. And we actually fixed these issues after the 1967 war and, Israel taking Sinai. So people know this. The people who know this. There are two elements here. Being ideologically motivated is really bad for intelligence and military operations, but also Israel is very good. So it's two elements. There it's very bad, and Israel is very good. So you see what's happening. And by the way, Egypt is nothing like Lebanon. Egypt is nothing like Hamas is nothing like Hezbollah. It's not or Iran. It's not that easily infiltrated because you're talking about a country that has seriously capable and trained, and also they've been working with the Americans, the CIA for many years. They've been working with the Europeans. So you can see the Egyptians are not that ideologically motivated when it comes to the government, or at least a function of the government, which is good, because the Israeli government can talk to Egyptian security officials
The
and Egyptian.
military, not to the political
Yes,
class. Yeah.
yes, exactly, to the military. So hopefully we'll be we'll see better days.
I do too. But so let's just, in terms of the conversation, what I took away is that you are very optimistic about most of the countries in the region. You're very about the Arab countries in the region. So the Iranians, I'm not optimistic. As long as this regime is there, it's a revolutionary regime. They're going to continue on with the revolution. That's how regimes like that work. Um,
Yes,
but all the other areas, we were very optimistic. Even Qatar, I was a little bit surprised. But next time we'll
yes,
maybe delve into that a little more. The only country that you are not optimistic about is your own home country. So, so that's a little
sadly,
bit depressing because you know that place very well, and you read Mubarak, Sisi's Mubarak. I remember Mubarak. I wish we were back with Mubarak with all his problems. Probably it's much
yes,
calmer area, calmer era. Um, so hopefully you're wrong on that. That's all I can say.
yeah,
I really hope that we will be able to somehow. It's very sad just because someone's Jewish to hate him, or just because someone's Arab to hate him. That's just my
yes.
feeling. So anyway, Khaled Hassan, it was amazing talking to you. I really appreciate. I think we should do another one, just on one, and maybe just on Egypt, because I think just to understand who President Sisi is, how he came to be, what is his thinking behind the scenes, and the people around him. I think that would be very interesting to our viewers and listeners. So maybe one in the
Absolutely,
future we'll do that. But for
yes.
now, I really appreciate you being with us. It was a pleasure, and we'll do this again sometime soon.
Thanks, Ariel. Yes, it was a pleasure being with you, and it's a fascinating conversation. I definitely think we should do one or two more on a couple of subjects that we to dissect completely.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And
Yeah.
yeah, thanks to your viewers, and I hope they'll enjoy this. And thanks again for having me.